They say birthdays are supposed to remind you that you are cherished, a day when the people you love gather not to judge but to honor you. Yet on my 32nd birthday, I was handed not love, but humiliation, the kind that burns so deep it etches itself into your bones. I stood there in front of a glowing cake, the candles flickering like little promises of joy, my friends and his friends circling me with expectant smiles, waiting for a toast or a tender word, when instead my groom lifted his glass, and in a voice sharp enough to silence the air, he laughed and said that I should get a job and stop being a leech. The words cut through the room like a blade, and suddenly the warm glow of the candles felt like a spotlight exposing every flaw, every insecurity, every sacrifice I had buried. If you have ever been laughed at when all you wanted was love, if you have ever had your heart broken in public while others turned your pain into entertainment, then you know why I share this, and I would be deeply grateful if you left a comment or a like, because your support is more than a button. It tells me and every woman listening that our voices matter, that we are not invisible, that we are not alone. My name is Charlotte Miller. I am 32 years old, and in that instant, surrounded by eyes that didn't blink, I felt myself shrink into someone I didn't recognize, a woman stripped bare by the man who was supposed to protect her. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, their forced laughter tight and strained, while others smirked openly as if I were a joke to be shared later. My face burned, my hands trembled at my sides, but I clenched them into fists beneath the tablecloth to keep them still. I forced a smile, the kind of brittle, practiced smile women wear when the only choice left is to pretend, when crying is too dangerous because it would give the cruelty more power. Inside, though, my chest was collapsing, my ribs tight as though each laugh pressed harder against me, the echo of his words ringing in my head until I felt dizzy, until I thought I might faint right there in front of them all. What made it unbearable was not just the insult, but the performance, because he hadn't said those words to me in private where I could have defended myself. He hadn't whispered them in anger during a fight. No, he had waited until the room was full, until all eyes were on me, and then he chose to slice me open with his smile. It wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. He wanted them to laugh at me, to see me as small, to see him as strong. And as I stood there, the taste of smoke and sugar thick in my throat when I blew out the candles, I realized how dangerous it was to love someone who found pleasure in tearing you down. I thought of everything I had given up for him, the career I had once dreamed of, the independence I had let go of, the comfort of being close to my own family. Because he had promised me a future, because he had promised me that if I trusted him, if I built my life around him, we would be unstoppable. And yet, here I was, nothing more than a burden in his eyes, a leech, his word ringing in my ears as if my years of sacrifice were erased in one moment of cruelty. But the truth he didn't know, the truth that simmered inside me as I smiled through the pain, was that I had not been idle, I had not been lazy or useless. For months I had been working in silence, late nights and early mornings, building something out of nothing, pouring my energy into a small business that no one knew about, not even him, because I had wanted it to be a surprise, a gift to both of us, proof that I could contribute, that I could carry my share. He had no idea that the woman he mocked for being a leech was secretly fighting to save them both. But in that room, none of it mattered. All they saw was the mask he painted over me, and I wore it because survival meant silence. The laughter rolled over me again, cruel and hollow, until I felt my stomach twist in knots. I clapped lightly, pretending to laugh along, because sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to pretend you are not bleeding. Yet every heartbeat was a reminder that something inside me had cracked, something that could not be mended with apologies or flowers, something that had shifted forever. Later, when the guests left and the house was quiet, I walked into the kitchen and stared at the cake. The candles were bent, the wax dripping like tears down the frosting, and I stood there frozen, listening to the echo of his voice as it replayed in my head. Leech. The word pulsed like a drumbeat, each repetition heavier than the last, until my knees buckled and I gripped the counter just to stay upright. I wanted to collapse, I wanted to let the tears come, but they wouldn't, because under the shame was something else, something sharper, something alive. It was anger, it was resolve. And in that silence, with the bitter taste of smoke still on my lips, I made myself a quiet promise. I would remember this night. I would remember every smirk, every laugh, every ounce of humiliation, because one day the balance would shift, and when it did, he would understand that the woman he mocked was never a leech at all. She was the storm he never saw coming. After that birthday humiliation, I tried to tell myself it was just a cruel joke, a careless moment, something I could forgive if I closed my eyes to the sting. But the truth is that it wasn't a single spark. It was the flame that revealed a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface for years. My groom had always carried a way of looking at me as though I were never enough, as though every effort I made was still just short of what he deserved. And once I allowed myself to see it, the memories came flooding back, like waves that had been waiting for the right storm to crash against me. I remembered the little barbs hidden inside his words, the way he compared me to women who earned more, to exes who were independent, to colleagues' wives who knew how to carry their weight. Each time he said those things, I had laughed nervously, brushing them off, telling myself he didn't mean it, but now I realized he had meant every single one. The way he acted in private was not much different from the spectacle he made on my birthday. He would come home and toss his jacket onto the chair, sighing dramatically, telling me how exhausting it was to carry the weight of being the only one providing. I would swallow my words, biting my tongue until it bled, because I knew I was working in silence on something that might change everything for us. And I thought if I just held out long enough, if I just kept building, I could show him one day and make him proud. But instead of growing closer, we drifted further apart. He began to treat me like furniture in his house, useful when he needed me, invisible when he didn't, and the words he once used to woo me. "You are my everything. I can't imagine life without you," were now replaced by silence, or worse, by mocking. I tried to hide my pain from others, but it showed in little ways. My smile, once warm and easy, became tight and cautious. I found myself shrinking in conversations, careful not to say too much, because I knew he would correct me or roll his eyes. He seemed to take pleasure in reminding me that I had given up my job for him, that I had chosen to follow his lead, and he twisted those sacrifices into chains, proof that I was dependent, that I couldn't survive without him. It was a clever cruelty because it left me questioning my own worth, wondering if maybe he was right, maybe I really was nothing without him. The escalation was slow, but relentless. In front of his friends, he would call me the princess, not as a compliment but as an insult, as if my life were some kind of free ride on his back. He started speaking about me as though I weren't in the room, saying things like, "She doesn't understand how hard real work is," or "She wouldn't last a day in my shoes." At first, people laughed politely, unsure if they should, but the more often he said it, the easier it became for them to join in. I felt the ground beneath me slipping, my dignity eroding piece by piece, and all the while I held onto my secret, the business I was building, the late nights spent in front of a glowing screen while he snored in the next room, the careful way I saved every dollar I could find to invest in myself. I held onto it like a lifeline, but in the meantime, the cracks in our relationship grew into chasms. One night, after another long day of him dismissing me, I sat alone in the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me had shadows under her eyes, lips pressed thin, and I barely recognized her. I whispered to myself that this couldn't be my future, that I couldn't spend my life being belittled by a man who should have lifted me higher. Yet I stayed silent. I stayed still, because I thought maybe the problem was me. Maybe if I worked harder, loved more, gave more, he would change. I didn't know then that abusers don't change when you give them more. They only grow bolder, because silence teaches them they can. But I remember that night clearly because it was when I felt the first flicker of something shift inside me. The humiliation of my birthday hadn't left me. It pulsed like a bruise that would not heal, and every new jab, every new comparison, every new insult pressed harder against it. I thought to myself, what if one day I stopped pretending? What if I let him see that I wasn't weak? What if the woman he called a leech was the very one who could rise without him? The thought was only a whisper then, faint and trembling. But it was there, a seed buried deep, waiting for its time to grow. After weeks of carrying the sting of my birthday, like a shadow that clung to me in every room, after swallowing the sharp edges of his comments that cut deeper, precisely because they were delivered with that casual smile, I began to feel as though I was slowly disappearing, as if my voice and my worth had been locked away somewhere I could no longer reach. Each morning I woke with heaviness pressing against my chest, and each night I lay in bed rehearsing conversations I would never dare have, trying to imagine how it would feel to demand respect, only to fall silent again, because his words echoed louder than mine ever could. Life became gray, a routine of keeping my head low, my smile practiced, and my tears hidden. Yet it was in that suffocating silence that something shifted, not dramatically, not with a bang, but with the faintest flicker that refused to be snuffed out, because one night, while the house lay still and his steady snores filled the darkness, I sat hunched over my laptop, its cold blue glow painting my face, and after months of clumsy effort and trial and error, after endless hours of second-guessing myself, I watched as a tiny notification blinked onto the screen, showing that a stranger had bought something I had created. It was only a small sale, hardly enough to buy a coffee, yet in that moment it felt like the universe had whispered that I was not invisible, that I was capable, and I pressed my hand to my mouth to stifle the sob that rose from somewhere deeper than sorrow, because for the first time in so long, I felt relief. I stared at that little number as though it were a jewel, tears blurring my eyes until the screen shimmered, and though no one else would have understood its meaning, to me it was everything. Because it meant the word leech was a lie, a weapon he had thrown at me that I no longer had to carry. I sat there for hours, staring at the proof that I could build something of value, my mind racing with what-ifs. What if this tiny beginning could become something greater? What if my late nights weren't wasted, but seeds planted in soil he didn't even know existed? What if the future he thought he owned wasn't his at all, but mine waiting quietly for the right moment? That night, even though exhaustion pulled at my body, I felt more awake than I had in months, and though I went to bed quietly before dawn, slipping under the covers beside him as he slept undisturbed, inside me, something small but undeniable had changed. That spark grew brighter a few days later, when another truth slipped into my life, not by choice, but by accident. He came home late again, his tie loose, his eyes glazed with arrogance, tossing his briefcase onto the dining table as if the weight of the world rested inside, and when he left it carelessly open, papers spilled across the polished wood. I bent to gather them, my fingers brushing over familiar lines of numbers, and what I saw made my stomach twist. Bills overdue, credit cards maxed, balances teetering at the edge. My hands shook as I flipped through the documents, disbelief turning to dread. The man who had mocked me for being useless, who stood proud in front of his friends calling himself the sole provider, was drowning in debts he had hidden from me. My chest tightened so hard I thought I might faint, because it wasn't just financial ruin staring back at me, it was the proof of his hypocrisy, the truth behind his cruelty. Every insult he hurled had been nothing more than smoke to hide his own failures. I tucked the papers back quickly, my face still and expressionless in case he noticed, but inside me a storm raged. For the first time, I saw that the cracks in our life weren't mine, they were his, and that knowledge changed everything. Suddenly, my tiny sale, my fragile secret business, didn't feel insignificant anymore. It felt like the first stone in a wall I could build for myself. If I worked harder, if I pushed past the exhaustion and the fear, maybe I could create something that not only carried me out of the prison he had built around me, but left him standing alone in the ruins of his arrogance. The thought wasn't cruel, it was clear, and as it pulsed through me, I felt strength return to places I thought had been broken forever. From that night on, his insults still burned, but they no longer hollowed me out in the same way, because beneath my silence I carried knowledge he couldn't touch, proof that he wasn't invincible and that I wasn't powerless. And when I caught my reflection in the darkened screen of my laptop after another long night of work, my eyes ringed with shadows, but sharper than they had been in months. I leaned closer and whispered words I had not dared believe. I am not nothing, I am not weak, and one day the balance will turn. That spark of hope did not erase my pain, but it lit an ember in the ashes of my humiliation, and though it was fragile, it was mine, and it was enough to keep me alive. Once the spark of hope had taken root inside me, I realized that I could no longer simply endure the cruelty and wait for it to pass. I needed to act quietly, carefully, and deliberately, because if humiliation had taught me anything, it was that silence could be both a weapon and a shield, and now I would use it for myself instead of against myself. Each night, when the house fell silent and his footsteps faded into the steady rhythm of sleep, I opened my laptop like a secret door into another life, pouring myself into learning, building, and refining, transforming clumsy beginnings into sharper skills, turning confusion into confidence, and little by little I began to shape something real. I made plans, set small goals, and tracked every tiny achievement, knowing that what looked like nothing on the outside was in fact the foundation of the world I was quietly creating. During the day, I kept my mask firmly in place, nodding when he spoke, pretending to agree when he mocked, letting him believe I was still the same fragile woman he could control with a look. But underneath that calm exterior, my mind was running, mapping out steps, connecting dots, preparing strategies that he would never imagine. I used the hours he thought were wasted on nothing to research, to reach out discreetly, to expand the fragile network of contacts who didn't even know my full story, but saw the value in what I was building. With every email I sent, with every lesson I completed, with every document I drafted, I felt a growing sense of control return to me, a steady rhythm of purpose that his words could no longer touch. The irony of it all was that he grew bolder with his cruelty the more silent I became, mistaking my calm for surrender, my quiet for weakness, and each time he laughed at me in front of others or sighed heavily as if carrying me were the greatest burden of his life. I smiled softly because I knew what he did not. He thought he was building a throne on my back, but what he couldn't see was that I was already dismantling it piece by piece, brick by brick, until one day it would collapse beneath him, and I wouldn't be there to catch the fall. That thought didn't make me bitter. It made me patient, because real strength isn't in shouting back when someone mocks you. It's in preparing a truth so powerful it leaves them speechless when it finally comes to light. And so my nights became my sanctuary, a place where I was no longer the woman who had been laughed at during her own birthday, but the architect of her own future, a woman who held in her hands the quiet power of knowledge, resilience, and preparation. The plan wasn't perfect, it wasn't grand, but it was mine, and every step I took toward it carried me further from the prison of his control and closer to the freedom I craved. I knew the road would be long and the sacrifices many, but I also knew that patience and silence could be sharper than anger, and as I closed my laptop each dawn and slipped back into bed beside him, I carried with me the satisfaction of a secret that grew stronger with every passing day. That the woman he thought was a leech was already preparing to become the storm that would one day strip him of everything he thought he owned. The more I built in silence, the louder his cruelty became, as though somewhere deep inside he sensed a shift he could not name, a crack in the old dynamic he relied on, and so he pushed harder, testing the boundaries of what I would endure. He began turning every gathering into a stage, slipping in small humiliations with a grin that made his friends laugh, calling me the princess who lived off his sweat, telling stories that painted me as fragile, helpless, and spoiled. I laughed along sometimes because survival demanded it, but inside I memorized every word, every smirk, every time someone glanced at me with pity or superiority, and each memory became another brick in the wall of quiet rage I was building. It was no longer just the insult of being misunderstood, it was the ache of being erased in front of others, of watching my identity reduced to his punchline, and I felt the weight pressing harder every day. At home, the escalation took different forms. He would come through the door sighing dramatically, tossing bills on the counter with a performance of exhaustion, as if I had placed those debts on his shoulders myself, when in truth I already knew whose carelessness had caused them. He accused me of not understanding how hard real life was, of wasting my time on hobbies that would never amount to anything, while he squandered money on things he didn't need, dinners I was never invited to, outings where he presented himself as the man who carried everything. The cruelty wasn't always in the words. Sometimes it was in the silence, the way he would ignore me at the table, his eyes glued to his phone, while I sat across from him invisible, as though my presence no longer mattered. Those silences were worse than the words, because they left me questioning whether I even existed to him anymore. The more he dismissed me, the harder I worked at night, but it was exhausting, balancing the weight of humiliation with the fragile hope I nurtured in secret. There were nights when I sat with my laptop open, staring at the screen through tears, my vision blurred until the words and numbers danced, and I thought of giving up, of closing it all and accepting the prison he had built for me. Yet each time, the memory of my birthday flared in my chest like fire, reminding me of the candles, the laughter, the smirk on his face as he called me a leech. That memory was unbearable, but it was also fuel, because I promised myself I would never let those words be the last truth spoken about me. I whispered in the darkness that one day he would know the real me, and the thought alone gave me strength to keep going. But even as I strengthened, the cruelty continued to escalate. One evening, at a dinner with his colleagues, he told a story about me that was not just mocking, but cruel, painting me as an embarrassment who couldn't handle responsibility, a woman who would crumble without him. They laughed, he laughed, and I sat there smiling faintly, my hands steady though my insides shook. And in that moment I realized that he believed completely in the image he had created. He was so sure of his control, so certain of his superiority, that he no longer saw me at all. And that was the moment the scales shifted in my mind. His cruelty no longer crushed me, it armed me, because I saw clearly that when the day came to reveal the truth, the fall would be even harder, because he had built his pride on lies, and I was the only one who knew how fragile those lies really were. The moment of change did not come with thunder or fire. It came quietly, almost deceptively, in a way that only I could feel, but once it arrived, nothing was the same again. I was sitting one night with my laptop open, surrounded by stacks of notes and scribbled plans, when I saw the first real sign that what I was building was more than just a fragile dream. An order came through that was larger than anything I had expected, not life-changing on its own, but enough to prove that what I had been creating in secret was growing roots, enough to make my chest tighten with something I had not felt in months: pride. For the first time since my groom's cruel words on my birthday, I felt strong again, as though the weight of humiliation was no longer crushing me, but instead fueling me, turning every late night into a stepping stone towards something real. That small success became a spark that spread through me, filling my veins with determination. Each insult he threw at me during the day only sharpened my focus at night, and every laugh that echoed at my expense became another reason to keep pushing. I realized then that the power he thought he owned was slipping, because the more he dismissed me, the less I cared about his approval, and the more I poured myself into my own future. His arrogance had blinded him to the truth that I was no longer depending on him. I was building something without him, and the irony was almost too sharp to bear. The man who thought I was his burden had no idea that I was already becoming free. The turning point deepened when I received a message from a client, a stranger who didn't know my story but who trusted me with something important, praising my work and telling me they would return. I read those words again and again, letting them sink into the cracks he had carved into me, and I felt them begin to heal. For so long my worth had been measured by his opinion, his approval, his temper. But here was proof that outside of his shadow I was valuable, that people saw me for more than what he had reduced me to. It was like a curtain being pulled back, revealing the life I could have if only I stayed the course. I understood then that my silence was not weakness, it was strategy, and one day that strategy would bring him to his knees. From that night forward, the balance inside me shifted. I still smiled when he mocked me, I still kept my voice low when he dismissed me, but my heart no longer broke under his weight. Instead, I began to see him differently, not as the powerful man he wanted the world to believe he was, but as a desperate actor clinging to a role, too blind to notice that the stage beneath him was collapsing. And as I closed my laptop at dawn, slipping back into bed while he snored obliviously, I carried with me not just hope, but certainty. The spark of change had become a flame, and though it still burned in secret, I knew that it would one day blaze bright enough to expose every lie he had ever told, and when that day came, I would not be the one standing small. He would. The days that followed were heavy with the same routine of dismissals and taunts, yet I no longer carried them like chains dragging me into the ground. Instead, I carried them like weights that strengthened me in secret, each insult feeding the fire that now burned steadily inside me. Outwardly, I kept my mask secure, nodding softly, smiling faintly, pretending still to be the woman he thought he controlled. But inwardly, I was sharpening myself with every hour I spent hidden in my quiet work. When he left for the day, I sat at the kitchen table with my notes spread wide, refining strategies, mapping timelines, tracking progress, and when he returned, I swept it all away as if nothing had been there, keeping my secret safe behind calm eyes. He believed completely in the illusion he had created, never suspecting that the silence he thought was surrender had become my shield, and the patience he mocked was transforming into my greatest weapon. The nights were where I truly lived. While the world slept, and he sprawled across the bed without a care, I sat in the glow of my screen, fingers flying across the keyboard, mind racing faster than it had in years, piecing together lessons I had taught myself, finding ways to turn small victories into larger ones, watching my once fragile project begin to stand taller. There were nights when exhaustion bent my shoulders, when the urge to cry pressed against my throat, but then I would remember his smirk on my birthday, the laughter that cut me open in front of everyone, and the memory would push me forward like a hand at my back. Every sale, every message of praise from strangers who valued my work, every small step of progress, became a brick in the foundation of my independence, and slowly, steadily, I began to see that what I was building was not just survival. It was a life waiting to unfold. I stopped reacting and started calculating, because rage without a map is only noise, and I needed a strategy that would turn every ounce of her arrogance into proof I could hold up in court and under the kitchen lights where everyone could see it. For days I lived in the quiet, the kind of silence that feels like sharpening a blade, poring over every receipt, every bank line, every little scrap I'd rescued from the trash, until patterns emerged like constellations. She shopped at the same boutiques, at predictable times, loved the same salon 2 blocks from our house, and always insisted on paying in person because she liked the attention of assistants and managers. Those habits were her weakness. They were small, mindless rituals she performed to feel powerful, and I realized that if I could match those habits to timestamps, signatures, and surveillance stills, I could build a timeline so precise that even the most defensive heart would have to acknowledge it. I drew up lists, circled dates, highlighted signatures, and for the first time in months, the terrified knot in my chest loosened into something resembling purpose. I called a consumer attorney the way someone calls a locksmith when they finally decide to lock the door for good, hands shaking but voice steady. And from that conversation, everything shifted from private grief to legal trajectory. The attorney listened without pity and then explained in clear, unsentimental terms what would make a case bulletproof. Signed receipts, time-stamped footage, bank verification letters, and at least one witness who could testify to seeing her use my card. He told me what I already suspected but needed to hear. Timidity is evidence kryptonite, so we outlined steps. Request copies of signed slips from each merchant, subpoena footage if necessary, file a formal fraud claim with the credit company, and prepare for a civil suit if restitution wasn't offered. He also advised discretion. A public accusation without paper would play into her hands and make me look hysterical. The plan required patience and precision, not drama, and I promised myself I would be surgical in every move, keeping my face calm while threading the rope that would bind her. While the legal gears began to turn, I worked on the social side, because law alone wouldn't fix the ruin she had sown among neighbors and family. I mentally cataloged who in our circle loved spectacle and who valued truth, and I quietly reached out to a couple of neighbors who had always been a little suspicious of her showy generosity, sharing only enough to test their reactions. One neighbor, Janet, responded with a cautious, "I always thought something felt off," and agreed to be present when the time came, not as a conspirator but as someone who could corroborate seeing the jewelry and items she had flaunted. I also messaged a manager at one boutique under the pretense of needing a refund for a wrongly charged item. The manager, who liked to be helpful, agreed to look into transactions on a particular day and mentioned they could print a copy of a signed receipt and possibly pull a still from the surveillance camera for my records. Every small confirmation was a brick in the case I was building, and every brick made me feel less like a victim and more like an architect of my own rescue. And all the while, I wore a mask for the family, letting her perform her victory lap because arrogance makes people loud and careless, and the louder they are, the more mistakes they make. I smiled at her when she bragged about treating herself, complimented her new dress while inwardly noting the price tags that matched the receipts I had highlighted, and I let her believe I was the same timid, forgiving woman she had always seen. It felt like a kind of acting, but it was necessary. Patience would ensure that when I finally pulled back the curtain, the audience would not only see the theft, but feel the cruelty of it. The plan was no longer just about money, though I wanted that paid back. It was about restoring my voice, reclaiming my dignity, and making sure that the woman who had learned to weaponize intimacy would face consequences in front of the people she used to manipulate. I tucked the growing folder of evidence into a drawer and closed it like a promise. I would wait until every piece was in place, and then I would make sure the world watched her fall. I set the scene carefully, because if you want someone to stumble, you do not shout from the rooftops. You place the banana peel and let them walk into it. And so I began to arrange my life like a quiet stage where everything looked ordinary while the trap tightened. I cleaned the house until it gleamed, set the table with the china my grandmother had left me, bought sparkling water in pretty bottles, and placed a single candle in the center. Not because I wanted romance, but because calm would make her arrogance louder by contrast. I wore a simple dress that didn't scream for attention and practiced a smile that was soft but controlled, the kind of smile that says nothing but hides everything, because she fed on spectacle and I planned to starve her of it until she revealed herself. Each morning I reviewed the folder of evidence, smoothing the papers until they lay flat and precise, and each night I slid them back into their hidden place where no mouse could sniff them out, all the while letting her believe I remained the same quiet woman she had always underestimated. Some moments felt unbearably intimate in their cruelty. She would call to check in and tell me about the salon appointment she loved, where the stylist complimented her new bracelet that matched a receipt in my pile, and she would describe the taste of a restaurant champagne I could see itemized on the statement, all while I listened and kept my voice even. I learned to let her talk because arrogance had become a weapon for her to overplay, and with each story she told, she gave me more detail I could use. Dates, times, names of clerks, even the way she signed her name with confidence. I found myself cataloging these admissions like a librarian, not because I wanted to hoard the pain, but because I needed an accurate map of her greed to guide my next moves. It was strange to feel so alone, yet so purposeful. While she believed she held all the power, I was quietly building a courthouse from the scraps of her vanity. From the heart, I need to tell you something that matters more than any legal victory. If you've ever felt dismissed, if you've ever had your pain turned into a punchline, please know your voice matters, even if it trembles. When you press like or take a moment to leave a comment, you are doing something small that echoes loudly. You tell someone sitting in a quiet room that they are not invisible, that there are people who see and who care, and for someone like me who spent long nights wondering if anyone believed me, those small actions were the lifeline that kept me moving forward. If this story touches something inside you, if it wakes a memory or lights a spark, don't keep it bottled up. Share it, say one word below, or click that heart, because for creators who share the hardest parts of their lives, your support is not vanity. It's oxygen that lets us keep telling truths that matter. All the while, I kept the outward picture of peace, because patience is a weapon that looks like passivity. And in the hush before the storm, I arranged a few quiet allies who would be with me when the curtain fell. Janet from next door agreed to come if I needed her. The boutique manager called back and promised a printed still from security, and my attorney sent an email confirming the subpoenas could be served if we needed them. These small confirmations were like the last checks you do before a plane takes off. Quiet, methodical, necessary. I placed the folder under the cushion of the chair she always favored and sat opposite her at dinner like the obedient daughter-in-law, while inside I hummed with a calm that felt almost foreign, because for the first time since the bills arrived, I was not simply surviving, I was preparing to make the kind of move that would stop her in her tracks and let the truth breathe. She began to move through our days like a woman who owned every room she entered, and I learned to let her think she had already won, because arrogance is loud and careless, and loud people make mistakes that the quiet can harvest. I stopped correcting her when she bragged about the treat her son had insisted she take. I did not flinch when she draped my stolen scarf over a visiting friend and basked in their admiration, and I answered her compliments with a measured smile that said nothing and revealed everything, because I knew the theater of her victory would make better evidence than any accusation shouted across the table. Letting her preen felt like swallowing glass, but there was a logic to it. She needed witnesses, she loved an audience, and the more she performed, the more she exposed the choreography of her theft. So I became a careful actress, offering the smile she expected while cataloging each boast, each name dropped, each proud detail that would later stitch into the case I was building. At family gatherings, she took every opportunity to display what she had bought, lifting the hem of a dress to show a new label, laughing at a joke about being able to afford anything now, and I watched the way neighbors' eyes followed her, felt their admiration like cold hands around my throat, and allowed the anger to settle into something colder and steadier, strategy. I let her tell the story of how generous my husband was, how he insisted she enjoy life, and I let her spin the narrative that I was a poor, frugal creature who could not possibly understand indulgence. Each lie was another thread I planned to pull. Inside the house, she left traces of her day carelessly, a boutique bag leaning against a chair, a receipt folded into a jacket pocket she left on a hook, a lipstick stain on a glass that matched the time on a statement, and I gathered these crumbs like a bloodhound, careful to record date, place, name, anything that turned a boast into proof. It felt cruel to be so patient while she flaunted the spoils, but patience was my ally because people who think they are untouchable forget to hide the footprints they leave. I learned to turn my face into a mask of calm while inviting witnesses into a life she wanted to control, because the most devastating blow would be one delivered in light where gossip could not twist it into melodrama. I invited Janet from next door for tea under the pretense of wanting to catch up, and I asked other neighbors over for a casual Sunday pie, seating them where they could see the mantle and the jewelry she liked to parade. I feigned weakness, letting her take the conversational lead as she described the salon who always knows how to treat a woman, and I nodded when she mentioned the boutique clerk by name, tucking each name into the pile of evidence like coins dropped into a jar. My husband watched me with that same blank look that had haunted me before, and this time I let his silence be the stage on which her confession would fall. I was tired of pleading for his help, So instead, I would let the truth land in front of him, with the weight of proof he could not ignore. I felt a strange calm at these gatherings, a stillness that was not resignation, but the heavy focus of someone about to push a boulder down a hill. The worst part of letting her think she had won was the loneliness it cultivated, because every smile I offered was a small death, and every compliment returned was a concession I would not regret later. And yet in that loneliness, I found a peculiar strength, the understanding that I no longer needed to explode to be heard. I kept my folder of printed receipts under the cushion of the chair she favored, watched her take the seat with that satisfied tilt of the chin, and rehearsed the moment I would open it, line by line in my head until the words and the proofs lined up like dominoes. Letting her believe she had triumphed meant she walked into a calm I had engineered, a quiet that promised thunder, and as I poured tea for the guests and smiled at her boasting, I heard the distant, perfectly ordinary sound of a doorbell ringing, a sound that brought with it the small, precise satisfaction of consequences arriving exactly on time. The day I chose was ordinary on the surface, a Sunday afternoon when neighbors would be out tending gardens and the house would hum with the small noises of family life, but I had arranged every ordinary detail so that the moment truth arrived, it would land in daylight where gossip could not twist it into melodrama. I asked my husband to join me for coffee and, under the polite pretense of wanting to clear up a household accounting question, I invited Janet and one other neighbor who had always admired good taste and loved to be included, and I called the boutique manager to confirm he could be present with a printed copy of the signed slip and, if possible, a still from the store camera, because I wanted everything to be undeniable and slow enough that no one could look away. The house looked calm and normal, but inside my chest a bass drum of nerves kept time as the coffee cooled, the folder of evidence heavy in my lap like a small furious heart waiting to be opened. And when she arrived wearing that same smug smile she always used to weaponize sympathy, I poured for her and listened as she began to narrate the day she treated herself in a voice that dripped with entitlement, oblivious that every word was another nail we were about to drive into the coffin of her lies. When the moment came, I did not shout or cry or collapse. I opened the folder with steady hands and placed the pieces of her arrogance on the table one by one like coins that could not be taken back. The signature that matched the birthday card, the printed receipt with the time and clerk's name, the boutique manager's note confirming the transaction and offering a still from their camera where, clear as daylight, she signed the slip herself. Each document slid across the table and landed with the quiet authority of facts. I watched her face change in stages, the practiced mask of indifference cracking into confusion, then flushing with color as she searched for excuses she had used so many times before. And I watched my husband's expression go from annoyance to bewilderment to something that looked dangerously close to shame, because the evidence removed the room for easy explanations and left only the cold, simple truth. Around us, the neighbors exchanged small noises that were not quite whispers anymore, but the first sounds of a story rebalancing. The woman who had been praised for her elegance suddenly found herself the subject of questioning glances, and the air that had always seemed to support her now felt thin and sharp. Her first instinct was to bluster, to claim mistake or misunderstanding, and she reached automatically for the narrative that had served her well for years, the one where I was the forgetful, dramatic daughter-in-law making mountains from molehills. But the manager's printed still and the neat stack of receipts left her words like paper thrown into a storm, useless and sodden, and when the bank representative on speaker confirmed that the pattern matched multiple confirmed transactions and that a formal fraud claim could be opened with this documentation, her voice shrank to a whisper. My husband stammered for words, trying to stitch the story back into something kinder, but the neighbors' eyes had already recorded the scene differently. If they had once admired her, they now watched the woman who had once been a model of propriety attempt to explain why her signature matched the charges that had nearly ruined another woman's life. I felt a cold satisfaction move through me that was nothing like triumph in the shallow sense. It was the hard, clean relief of a wound finally exposed to air so it could heal, and as she lowered her gaze, The room seemed to tilt toward the truth in a way it never had before. When it was over, the silence that followed was not the same as before. It was heavier and different because it held the recalibration of relationships, the settling of dust after a gust that changes the shape of the room. People who had once seen her as untouchable now glanced at her rings with the new knowledge that they had been bought with another woman's labor. And my husband sat with his hands folded, the kind of silence that asks questions he could not easily answer. She tried to make a final excuse, a soft lament about temptation and aging, but the neighbors' faces registered more disappointment than pity, and there is no stronger social penalty than the shift from admiration to doubt. I left the folder open on the table and felt the air change in the house, less like a courtroom than like a place where truth had finally been allowed to breathe. And while the consequences were only beginning to take shape, the bank would continue its investigations, legal steps could follow, and restitution might be sought. The most immediate thing was the way our small community now held a new memory of her, one that would ripple through dinner conversations and backyard chats for years, and that memory would be harder for her to rewrite than any lie she had told before. After the reckoning, the dynamics of our house shifted the way light changes when clouds move. The warmth that used to wrap around her claims of benevolence thinned into something brittle, and I could see, in the small, unguarded moments, how fragile her confidence had been all along. My husband retreated into himself for a time, and his silence was not the same as before. This time, it was the silence of a man who knew he had been mistaken and was quietly recalibrating what loyalty meant. He began to ask questions, not to defend his mother reflexively, but to understand how he had missed the signs, and in that slow, awkward reordering, I found space to speak without being dismissed. The neighbors who had once nodded approvingly at her dresses now offered small, tentative gestures of support when our paths crossed, comments that said without grand words that they saw me, and the sting of being believed after so long was unlike anything I had expected, a peculiar balm that felt part vindication, part apology from the world for having looked the other way. The law did its work in the way the attorney had promised. The formal complaints were filed, the bank flagged the charges as disputed while investigators requested documentation, and the boutique cooperated with copies of signed slips and a still from their camera that matched the manager's testimony, tying the purchases to the date on the statement. The practical outcome mattered. A path was opening to restitution and the possibility of clearing my name and credit. But there was also a moral realignment that felt deeper. The woman whose small cruelties had become part of my daily life was now constrained by something she feared more than any neighbor's glance: accountability. People like her survive on ambiguity and plausible deniability, but once the ledger is revealed and witnesses remember what they saw, the ambiguity evaporates, and with it, the power to manipulate. I watched as she attempted to maintain appearances while dealing with calls from the bank and awkward conversations with friends who now asked pointed questions, and the sight of her trying to reclaim dignity that was no longer hers felt less like gloating and more like the quiet settling of justice into place. It did not heal everything. Wounds do not vanish overnight because a name has been cleared or a check is issued, and the relationship with my husband required rebuilding that would take time, conversations, and small acts of realignment that proved caught promises could be made whole. There were hard talks about boundaries, about what it meant to choose your partner over your parent when those roles conflict, and there were moments when I had to sit with the reality that trust, once broken, needs daily tending. Yet through those difficult conversations, a steadiness formed. I stopped shrinking, stopped glossing over my needs to maintain a fiction of peace, and in their place grew stipulations and lines I would not allow to be crossed again: locked drawers, separate finances for safety, and a clear understanding between me and my husband that our household belonged to both of us equally. Watching the woman who had once been a constant storm in my life shrink into someone who could not rely on the same automatic deference she had always received was not a joyless event. It was the restoration of balance, the world righting itself in small but meaningful ways. Perhaps the most telling change was not the restitution talks or the legal paperwork, but the way our everyday interactions lost their poisoned edge. Family dinners were quieter, yes, but less tense, and the cruel little comments that had once been tossed across plates like knives were now slowed by the memory of what had happened. She tried at times to reclaim her old throne with gestures of contrition that felt rehearsed and thin, and I received them with the safety of distance, polite but guarded, because forgiveness without change is a trap I would not fall into again. I had learned the hard lesson that kindness is not weakness, and that the person who uses intimacy as a weapon must be met with rules that protect rather than vague pleas that fail. The power had shifted, not because I wanted revenge for its own sake, but because I needed to live without fear, and in that necessity I found strength I did not know I possessed, a voice clear enough to say no, and to expect that the no would be respected. In the weeks that followed the paperwork and the calls, life began to recalibrate around a new, quieter normal. Restitution negotiations advanced slowly. The bank adjusted timelines and offered steps to repair my credit. And the boutique's cooperation made the trail of evidence tighter. But perhaps more importantly, the social ledger had been rewritten so that the woman who once moved through rooms like a monarch now moved with a more fragile dignity. I took steps that felt small but enormous after months of erosion. I changed passwords, I set up alerts on my accounts, I kept the card locked in a safe, and I began to attend to my finances openly with my husband present, so there would be no more secrets that could be weaponized in the dark. The practical things mattered because they anchored me. They were the scaffolding on which a life rebuilt itself, piece by careful piece. And with each locked drawer and joint financial check, I felt a little less like someone rebuilding from ruins and more like someone reclaiming a house for good. Emotionally, the aftermath was messy and slow in a way I had not anticipated. There were nights when anger flared, and I would find myself staring at her empty chair and feeling waves of contempt and sorrow. Abrupt, sharp, but then fading into a tired relief that the most dangerous part, being invisible in the face of harm, was finally over. My husband and I went to counseling to understand how his loyalty had been manipulated and to learn how to repair the trust he had broken in my eyes by dismissing me so easily. And those sessions were humbling and raw and profoundly necessary, because reconciliation without understanding is shallow. Our relationship did not return to what it had been, nor should it have. Instead, it shifted into something more honest, with boundaries and conversations that were once avoided, now routine. And through that slow, careful work, I found myself regaining parts of myself I had put away to keep the peace. The moral I carry with me now is simple and compact like a proverb. Kindness is not an invitation to be used, and when someone reaches for your goodness thinking it is weakness, life has a way of returning what was taken, sometimes with interest. I do not gloat at her loss. Cruelty is a sad thing to watch unfold, and I do not wish failure on anyone as a form of celebration, but I do accept the quiet satisfaction that comes from justice when it is earned by truth and patience rather than vindictiveness. I sleep better now, not because all wounds are healed, but because I no longer lie to myself about the cost of silence, and the sweetest part of the whole ordeal is not the restitution or the social correction, but the small, still moments where I catch my reflection and recognize the woman who refused to stay small any longer. Life after betrayal is not perfect, but it is honest, and in that honesty, I have found a kind of freedom I did not know I deserved. And if you've listened with me all the way to the end, I want to ask you for something simple but so important. Hit that like button, leave me a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Tell me what part of this story hit you the hardest, or if you've ever been through something that made you feel invisible the way I did. Your words and support are what keep stories like this alive. They're what give me the strength to keep opening up and sharing the raw, painful, and powerful moments of my life. Every single click, every single comment, it really does matter more than you think, and I can't wait to read what you felt as you listened.